I'd read the book and I read the script, and what's wonderful about working with Barry is he has these very strong initial instincts for things, and his initial instinct, I remember he said to me, he was feeling brass and horns. So I sort of went on a journey exploring mixtures of trumpets and flugelhorns and French horns and cornets, and that was kind of our starting point. But that was something I did while he was shooting, and then right when he was finished, I started showing him some ideas.
But so when he says like I'm hearing horns, do you just like gather every like horn imaginable, or do you just pick one horn to start with?
You just really start brainstorming, because also I think the idea, the film is set in the 1970s in New York City, and I'm from New York, and I think there may be a sort of idea that New York City in the mid 20th century calls to mind of like what that might sound like, and I think there's elements of jazz possibly, but also I think I was trying to explore something that felt like it was neither directly jazz or directly classical. I was trying to do something that felt sort of its own, hopefully its own kind of a sound world for the film, and we really found that together. Barry and I work really closely together, and we'll just get in my studio for days on end and experiment with things. And I think actually what we discovered with the brass was that it wasn't enough for the film. The film felt like it was missing something, and we discovered that it was missing strings. And the film is about love and injustice, and for us, the strings came to feel like love. And so there's a lot of exploration and evolution of the ways in which the strings and brass interact.
That's funny because after the trailer dropped, I said to someone, "Oh my God, I love the score," and it sounds like what love would sound like.
Oh, thank you.
Because it's just kind of, it like swells with like tension and romance. So was that something you discussed when you were talking about the horns and the strings?
Absolutely. Yeah. And what was interesting too is I think with film scoring, there's this very almost abstract thing that happens where you're trying to connect words or feelings with sounds, and it's very not obvious, I think, because it's certainly not to me where how something is going to feel when you put it against the picture. I think you guess, and you hope. But what was interesting with that piece actually was that's a piece that initially those chords and those motifs were written for the very beginning of the movie, where you see Tish and Fonny walking together, and they're so deeply in love, and it's this almost perfect kind of a love that we're trying to express. And Barry said to me that he wanted it to feel like joy. And so I think throughout those moments when they're together, there's this feeling of, I was trying to go for this feeling of almost like these sort of upward sloping musical ideas that feel like they're almost reaching upward. And I think that almost sort of musically symbolized that feeling of joy and love.
So how did you land on strings as the missing element? Did you consider other instruments?
Experimentation. Just, honest, I think in Moonlight, Barry and I had done a lot of work with strings, and I love strings. My wife is a cellist. Many of my close friends are string players, and I love working with the sound of strings because strings are an incredibly flexible sound world. But with a lot of things, again, it's you try things out, and I think you don't know necessarily what's going to work, and the movie kind of, as you're working on it, and as Barry and the editors are putting the film together, I think you sort of uncover things that are missing, and you evolve with that.
It did remind me of the Moonlight score because I think they're like in the same vein because there's a lot of strings in that as well. Like,
there's definitely strings.
Yeah,
yes.
middle of the world. But like those strings, they were more kinetic, and that was perfect for that story and those emotions, which were more turbulent. And here it's more lyrical and smooth, but like they both represent love, like in their own ways. Like,
absolutely.
Did you consider like with Moonlight in mind when you were? Or not at all?
Not well. Actually, I think having done Moonlight, with Barry, I think I definitely approach every movie like its own completely new world that you want to explore. But I think there's also a sense of like for example, on Moonlight, Barry and I had done that we had explored this technique called chopped and screwed music, where you take a recording and you slow it down, and when you slow it down, the pitch goes down, and you get this very deep and rich texture. And that was a sort of idea that I would write music and record music, and then we would chop and screw it. And so there's this idea of like, well, what are we, is there an idea like that on Beale Street, or is there something like that? And what we actually found was there was sort of even more extreme experimentation we did in Beale Street, but it was for all the areas in the film that dealt with injustice. So, for example, in the sequences where Tish is meeting with Hayward the lawyer, where Daniel and Fonnie are first talking about when Daniel's talking about his experience in prison, this feeling of the horrors of injustice and of unjust incarceration. What we actually did was I would take elements of the music that you hear in the love and the joyful sequences, and I would actually take them and distort them and morph them. So the music you actually hear in some of these horrific moments is the music from the joyful places. But Barry would say, he was like, let's break it. How do we break it? How do we bend it and take it to this almost like dark doppelganger of the other parts of the film.
Mm-hmm. What was the most difficult piece for you to compose for Beale Street?
That's a good question. I think there's a sequence towards the end of the film where Fonnie is. It's kind of almost a dream sequence where Fonnie is remembering himself sculpting. There's a sequence where the camera's swirling around him and you see the smoke in the room and he's sculpting, and it's a memory. You see him remembering this as well. And Barry's great because he'll always say up front the parts of the movie he thinks are going to be hard to score. So he'll say,
"Is that a challenge?"
Yeah, he's always like, "This will be a tough one. This will be a tough one." So I'm like, "Great, okay." So I always wait to do those because I feel like so much of this process is you're figuring things out, and you don't, the things that are working. You put those things together, and they'll help you figure out later things to solve. But that sequence came at the end, and what actually happened was I created something where it was almost a mixture of it was music, but it was also a soundscape where I wove in the actual musical motifs from many of the different themes that you hear in the movie, and they're sort of floating in some way. So, because Barry talks about how the work we're doing in the film, we don't want to tell you this is how Fonnie feels. We want you to feel what Fonnie feels. We want it to be an immersive kind of direct feeling. And so I was trying to write something that wasn't telling you this is what Fonnie's feeling. I wanted you to almost, hopefully, experience it in that way where these things are sort of floating through your consciousness. Exactly.
While switching over to Vice, you reteamed with Adam McKay for this one. You did The Big Short. So how did you get on board here? When did he call you up for this?
I started talking to Adam about Vice after The Big Short. He knew, he's known for a while. He wanted to do a film about Dick Cheney. He's been fascinated by the story, and I started talking to him early on, even while he was writing drafts of the script. And what was interesting was imagining, the story is a huge story. It spans 5 decades. It's the story of the past, half century of American experience, and it's the story of this one fascinating person and the repercussions of his actions. And I think, initially Adam's instinct was a very symphonic scope, and the idea was, what is this sort of American symphony that we could write for this massive story? And in a lot of ways that ended up becoming kind of what happened, where I did write this very, very large sort of symphonic score, but along the way we found, like with any of these projects, you sort of find the things that are missing. And we found that as we went through different periods of time, there were moments where it needed a different sound than what a symphony orchestra had. So, for example, there's big band jazz I wrote. There's some rock. Is
that just to reflect the time period?
Different time periods and also character as well. I think it's a mixture where, for example, there's this very sort of hugely intense big band music that I wrote for Donald Rumsfeld. You know, there's a massive hip hop track I wrote for Dick Cheney when he's taking over in Washington in the early 2000s. And just as an aside, it's fascinating because you know that there's a track called "The Many Offices of the VP" because Dick Cheney actually had offices all over Washington. He had an office in the CIA. He had an office in the Pentagon.
Show it in the movie.
Exactly. He had an office in the White House. He had, I believe, 2 offices in the Senate, and he had an office in the House. So he was all over. He was all over Washington, and it felt like a hip-hop track which actually incorporated some of the other elements winding over themselves in that was interesting. So again, a lot of these scores sort of evolve as you watch the film come together.
Well, most biopics they're about someone who's heroic, like there's some like triumphant aspect to their story, but this movie, it's an indictment of Cheney and the damage he's done. So how do you keep that in mind when you're working on the music, while also considering the fact that for him, like he was successful, like he accomplished what he set out to do?
Well, exactly. I mean, it is a complex undertaking because there are these very grave repercussions to his actions, but at the same time, I think in order for the film to be, you know, a true representation of what happened, and also to accurately reflect the complexity of the world and the story, you have to deal with it in a very, very serious way. And the music was, in some ways, a combination of the things that you were saying, where I was imagining, you know, there may be a sort of typical sound of like, what is an American sound? You know, what is the sound of a hero's journey? And yet this isn't a typical American story, and this isn't a typical hero's journey. So, you know, thinking about that sound, like maybe there's a trumpet fanfare, you know, maybe there's a symphonic sweeping kind of sound, but if you inject a dissonance into everything that is there, and you sort of explore how, you know, what if you put the wrong note there? You know, what if you add something that feels like there's a rub, you know, like it's not quite right?
What do you use to?
So there were lots of different ways of doing that. So, for example, there's Dick Cheney, when he was young, he worked the power lines. He was a lineman in Wyoming, and he actually said later on that was his favorite job. But he worked the lines, and so there was this theme that we called the lineman, where it was almost like his motif, and it's a trumpet fanfare where the trumpets have what you would think of occasionally as the wrong note. That's just kind of outside bounds, and you know, hopefully it's subtly implying that there's something else going on here. You know, that's one way to do it. There's also dissonance, I think, in the sense of juxtaposition. You know, choosing a piece of music. You know, there are certain sequences where you're seeing something, and then you can have a weird dissonance with what's the choice of the music here. You know, like we can say, what are we really saying with this? You know, it could be, you know, you could have a very, very joyous piece of music against something that's in juxtaposition with something where it doesn't make any sense, and then you're making a commentary. So there were a lot of techniques for that dissonance, but I would say that the focus of a lot of the musical composition was figuring out ways of incorporating dissonance.
Well, it is a very dark story, but there's a lot of light moments, and it's very irreverent, just like The Big Short. So how do you balance those aspects?
That's a big question. I think it's a constant discussion. You know, I don't think there's, you know, moment to moment, scene to scene. It's something, I think, and especially with the size of the story being told, it's something where we worked so closely together. Hank Corwin, our amazing editor, and Adam McKay and I would basically be together all the time. I was living at Adam's house, you know, so we were.
Was he just like bring home like?
I mean, I was living in his pool house. I mean, we would talk about this all the time, and I think, you know, that's the kind of thing where you balance the tone very delicately. You know, I think the amount of comedy or darkness, those are things that vary depending on where we are in the cut, how we view the whole film. And I think one of the things Adam does, which is really wonderful, is he watches the movie a lot, and we all watch the movie a lot together, like start to finish, because I've definitely had it happen where I'll work on a sequence and I'll feel really great about it. But then if you zoom out and watch the movie, you're like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Why did I do, because on a micro level, things can work.
Yeah.
That on a macro level, you realize, oh, that doesn't.
Did that happen here?
Oh, that always happens. That happens on everything. I think that's the power of sort of zooming out sometimes and saying, oh, it is a complex endeavor. I mean, I think scoring a film is a very, it's a very kind of mysterious process of what are the right things, and you just ultimately have to follow your feelings and obviously the feelings of the director and the editor.
Well, there's the big gag in the middle of the movie that's kind of a spoof on your typical inspirational biopic. So how much fun did you have working on that piece?
I won't do the spoiler. I won't do the spoiler, but that was a very fun piece because I remember we recorded with an amazing orchestra in London, and I remember telling the orchestra, you can this can be a little bit absurd. Like it's okay, just go there. Just go there. It's totally fine, And that was a lot of fun to write a cue like that, yeah.
So what are you working on now?
Well, actually, I'm just about to start brainstorming the second season of Succession.
Another
HBO
Adam
show.
McKay joint.
Adam McKay and Jesse Armstrong are the creator. And I've started talking to Barry. Barry has a project called The Underground Railroad that I've started talking to him about as well. And I'm working on a film musical next year with Benjamin Millepied, which is inspired by Carmen, but it will have all original music. So, yeah.
Nice.